Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Clifford May, founder and president of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Clifford, thank you so much for joining me.
Good to be with you, Brittany.
It is good to be with you because negotiations between Hamas and Israel are ongoing and they're reportedly promising. Secretary of State Antony Blinken reportedly told NBC that we are, quote, closer than we've ever been, and emphasized, quote, it's very close and we are very hopeful that we get it over the finish line finally after all this time. And what we're talking about is a hostage release and ceasefire deal. So, can you talk to us about the state of negotiations? Where exactly are we?
Well, first, I think it's important to understand what these negotiations are all about. We're talking about hostages, innocent civilians who have been taken and pulled into tunnels, into dungeons. They've not been allowed to see the Red Cross. Some have been tortured. Many have been killed. We think maybe 33. I don't could come back in the first group. We don't really know how many are alive. In exchange for that, there would be a ceasefire, and there would be also convicted terrorists released from Israeli prisons. Probably not to Gaza, maybe some to the West Bank, more likely to Qatar, Turkey, or some other third country. Um, the what we believe that we know is that the Israelis have signed off on the agreement as it's been as it is, and that Hamas will be thinking about it and making a decision sometime over the next few hours of whether they accept it. What Hamas has done many times in the past, over the past year or so, is to say, yeah, this is fine, but we have three more demands. And then nothing comes of it. So while everybody is hopeful, keep that in mind. The Israelis very much want this. Biden wants this in his tenure. Trump wants this before he comes into office. So there's a lot of pressure on Netanyahu. How much pressure on Hamas? Who knows who puts pressure on Hamas? Perhaps the Qataris. They may say this is the best deal you're going to get. So I can tell you more about what we know about the deal, but that's sort of the state of play as we understand it.
Before we get into what exactly is in this deal, I've talked with analysts from the FDD for 15 months since October 7th, and Hamas and Israel have been to the table many times, and there's been negotiations. There's been a temporary ceasefire, even, but there has not been a permanent ceasefire release of all the hostages. So, what do you think makes talks different this time around?
I think talks are different on this time around only because we're about to have a transition from one president to another here in the US. I think also very important is I think that Hamas now sees things have not gone quite the way they expected when they launched this war on October 7th, 2023, by invading Israel and staging a barbarous pogrom that included multiple rapes, multiple murders, killing children, all of that. Why did it not go this as they expected? Well, at this point, Hezbollah in Lebanon, which began bombing Israel the day after October 7th, October 8th, has been decimated. Hamas may have two brigades out of 24 that remain. We're not sure of that. Certainly, they don't have the weaponry they had. They probably lost 17,000 terrorists. That's about half the people who've been killed in Gaza are probably terrorists. These numbers can't be exact, but I think those are reasonable estimates by people who are fairly expert in this field. It's also true that the Islamic Republic of Iran can't support Hamas the way it was once hoped. Why? Because after the Islamic Republic of Iran launched drones and missiles at Israel, Israel fired back, destroyed missile defense systems, destroyed a lot of the rockets. The Islamic Republic of Iran is now vulnerable. Finally, the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria has fallen. This was essentially a colony of Iran. It no longer is. And the Israelis very quickly went into Syria during this kind of revolution and knocked out 80–90% of the military assets that were in Syria, the Navy, the Air Force, all of that. So the new government in Syria doesn't have any of that. So Hamas does see they have a very weakened position. They don't have anyone backing them. Maybe they think, hard for me to read their mind, how long do we want to stay in these tunnels with our hostages? Do we want to get out and go to some other country, which could be part of the deal? We haven't heard that, but could be. Or are we going to just stay here and continue to pop out of the tunnels and shoot Israelis when we can, and for as long as it lasts, and just hope that all the protests at the UN and on Columbia University and Harvard will eventually force Israel to back down and let us take over Gaza again.
To your point there, President Biden was on the phone with Prime Minister Netanyahu last night. Reportedly, he said that the changing landscape in the Middle East is a factor here. So, how has that changing landscape really benefited Israel when it comes to these negotiations, if at all?
Well, Israel is in a much stronger position now within the Middle East. It's in a stronger position in Lebanon. There is a ceasefire in Lebanon. I'm not sure it's going to hold, but there is one. And more importantly, perhaps the Israelis have destroyed much of the munitions and rocket launching facilities and rockets and central commands facilities that Hezbollah had in southern Lebanon, all of which was in preparation for an invasion of Israel from the north. That didn't happen and now can't happen probably, certainly for several more years, and not at all if Hezbollah is not allowed to rebuild. And Hezbollah can't be resupplied through Syria because of what Israel's done. So the landscape is very different. Israel is no longer as it was maybe a year ago, on its back foot, getting pummeled. It's a rather different. Now there are other considerations that at play here. Hamas does not want Israel to remain, say, in what's called the Philadelphia corridor. That's the border between Gaza and Egypt, and through that border, in tunnels and above ground for years, weapons have been supplied to Hamas. I think most of the tunnels have probably been destroyed by now, but the Israelis don't want to leave because they don't want Hamas resupplied with bullets, RPGs, drones, missiles, and other equipment such as that. And then there's the question of, and a very important question, if you have a ceasefire, who decides when that ceasefire is broken? If Hamas terrorists pop out of a tunnel and shoot an Israeli and kill them, does that break the ceasefire? Does it have to be decided by, I don't know, Biden over the next few days or by Trump the days after? These are details we don't know, but they are important details.
Those are important details. So, what are the details we know? What are some of the sticking points that you know about these negotiations that you know in this deal?
Well, we don't know exactly. I can't say I've seen the deal on paper. So I'm hearing different reports from different sources, let us say. But all the things we've just discussed. What's the first phase of the ceasefire? Probably 33 hostages released. Which hostages? They were called the humanitarian hostages, women, those who are very ill, those who need very much in need of medicine, probably not Israeli soldiers, nobody who was wearing a uniform, not in the first phase. There would have to be a second phase. The ceasefire might disappear if in the second phase, the remaining hostages were not released. Here's another question we have. Do the Israelis have from Hamas a list of the surviving hostages? Why is that important? Because if they don't have that list, it is possible Hamas will deliver dead hostages with fresh bullet wounds in their heads. Israelis cannot make a deal and get stuck in that way. They have to know when you say you're going to deliver hostages, are they alive? Who's alive? How many alive? They don't want, I mean, they want the bodies back. That's part of Israeli culture and religion, but they also want to know who's alive and make sure they get them alive. And for that, and then the other question is how many of the terrorists, of course, that are incarcerated in Israel will get released. From what I understand, no one involved in the October 7th attack will be released. And as for those who are guilty of multiple murders and terrorist incidents, I don't know how far down it goes or how many it goes. Keep in mind that a few years ago, the Israelis released more than 1,000 terrorists for one Israeli soldier. Among those terrorists released was Yahya Sinwar. Who is Yahya Sinwar? He was the leader of Hamas at the time of the October 7th, 2023 attacks. He's dead now, but his brother is believed to be in the tunnels and now leading. That's Mohammed Sinwar.
You mentioned the political time we are in domestically. Biden has 1 week left. In a week from today, Donald Trump will be sworn in, and he's said multiple times, essentially, all hell will break loose if Hamas does not release those hostages by the time he's inaugurated. So, how much pressure is the United States putting on Hamas and Israel to make this deal happen?
I would say the Biden administration is putting considerable pressure on Israel, and President Trump is trying to put considerable pressure on Hamas. Um, what he means when he says all hell will break loose, we don't know exactly, although J.D. Vance on one of the Sunday programs over the weekend gave us a clue by saying we will enable Israel to do a great deal more. Keep in mind that the Biden administration has supported Israel, but also with a hand often tied behind their back. And sometimes the Israelis have accepted the restraints and sometimes they have not. So when Biden said, I don't want you to go into Rafah, they did go into Rafah and they wouldn't have gotten Sinwar if they had not. I think Trump will say, you do what you have to do, I think, and tell us how we can be helpful.
This sounds like the most promising these negotiations have been going in the past 15 months. The fact that Blinken has said that multiple times, we are very close. This is the closest we've ever been. So, specifically, what are you looking out for next?
Well, it's really I hate to say it this way, but the ball remains as it has been in Hamas's court. If Hamas wants a ceasefire, if Hamas is willing to give up the hostages, it will happen. If Hamas decides no, the hostages are the chips we have to play, and we will not give them up for anything. If Hamas leaders, the commanders in the tunnels think we want to die as martyrs. That's part of this mission. We don't want to go to Algeria or Turkey or somewhere like that. We'll stay here. We'll fight. We'll kill Israelis as long as we can. And through our martyrdom will be an inspiration for the wars that follow against Israel. One has to keep in mind, Hamas does not want a two-state solution. Hamas does not want a ceasefire. Hamas wants to build back in order to achieve its goals, which have always been very specifically, it's in the charter, they say so, to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. That's their goal.
To that point, then, when you're talking about the changing circumstances in the Middle East, you said Israel's no longer on its back foot. Why then is the ball in Hamas's court essentially?
Because the Israelis have made an offer. That offer has been facilitated by the Biden administration. They said, this is what we can do. The Qataris, the Turks, and others have said Hamas needs A and B and C. It's got to be in there. They've gotten to a point where the Israelis have said, here's the offer. It's on the table. Essentially, we believe they've said, we'll accept it as is. Now Hamas gets to say, okay, we accept it too. Then it has to be verified that they live up to it. Or they may say, no, again, we want three more things. And maybe there are things that Israel can't do. Don't forget that Netanyahu, yes, he's being pushed by Biden. Yes, he wants to do what Trump wants to do. But he lives in a democratic system, and not all members of his party or of his coalition are in favor of this deal as it is. Quite a few of them, probably about 10, think this goes too far. And that at the end of the day, it has to be very clear who wins this war and who loses. Ceasefire should not be confused with peace. The ceasefire may mean that both sides or one side gets to rebuild, reconstitute, regroup, and start the war all over again. Misunderstanding that, mistaking a ceasefire for peace is a common mistake made by diplomats.
To that point, then, in a week, it's going to be a totally new administration in the United States. And we've had a completely changed landscape in the Middle East in the past 15 months. So, how different will that look in relation to the Trump administration?
Well, we'll see what the Trump administration does. I have some certainly hope that President Trump, advised by his National Security Director, Michael Waltz, and by Mark Rubio at the State Department and others, will understand the national security threats that the United States and its allies now face. Tehran, the regime there, which has been saying death to America, chanting that since 1979, death to Israel, should not have a nuclear weapon or the means to deliver it. Every president has said that. None of them have done much about it. I think the Trump administration may understand that Tehran, this regime, this jihadist regime, is very much in an axis with Beijing, with Moscow, and with the North Koreans and others. And this is an axis that is very much anti-American. They're trying to change the world order. I do think that the Trump administration will understand this. in a way that I don't think the Biden administration quite has.
Well, there's certainly a lot to look out for. The situation is developing, and as it does, Clifford May, I hope you come back on and join me. Thank you so much for the conversation.
Anytime, Brittany, my pleasure.